I clutched the auction catalog in my trembling hands, staring at the photographs of my most precious possessions. My grandmother's pearl necklace. My mother's diamond engagement ring. The sapphire brooch my late husband Harold gave me on our 25th anniversary. All of it was there, listed for sale with estimated values that made my heart race. But what made my blood run cold wasn't seeing my jewelry in that catalog. It was the conversation I'd overheard 3 days earlier that had led me to this moment. She doesn't need her jewelry anymore, my daughter Patricia had said with such casual cruelty that I'd nearly gasped aloud from my hiding spot behind the kitchen door. Mom's practically living like a hermit anyway. When's the last time she even left that room of hers? My son Robert had actually laughed at that. You're right. And with her memory going, she probably won't even notice half of it's missing. We could start with the smaller pieces and work our way up. The appraisal came back higher than I expected, Patricia continued, and I heard the rustling of papers. That Victorian set alone is worth $30,000. The diamond collection could pay for both kids' college funds with money left over. That's when my youngest, Michael, had chimed in with the words that shattered what remained of my heart. Honestly, it's just sitting there doing nothing. She's 93 for crying out loud. How much longer does she really need any of this stuff? They were planning to steal from me. My own children, the ones I'd raised and sacrificed for, were conspiring to sell my most treasured possessions behind my back. As I sat in the auction house now, watching families browse the preview items, I wondered how many other elderly parents were being betrayed by the children they'd loved unconditionally. My name is Evelyn Hartwell, and for 93 years, I've prided myself on being a woman of dignity and grace. I raised 3 children as a widow after my Harold died in 1987, working double shifts at the hospital where I was a nurse supervisor just to keep them in decent schools and clothes. I never remarried, dedicating every spare moment and dollar to ensuring Patricia, Robert, and Michael had opportunities one never did. Patricia, my eldest at 65, had always been the practical one. She married young to a businessman named Frank, had 2 children, and lived what most people would call a comfortable middle-class life. But comfortable was never enough for Patricia. She wanted more house, more cars, more expensive vacations. More than Frank's steady but modest income could provide. Robert, my middle child at 62, had followed his father into the insurance business. He'd done well for himself, living in a sprawling suburban home with his wife Carol and their twin boys. But Robert had expensive tastes and even more expensive habits. Golf club memberships, luxury cars, investment properties that never seemed to pay off the way he'd promised they would. Michael, my baby at 58, had been the dreamer of the family. He'd tried his hand at several businesses over the years. A restaurant that failed within 2 years, a construction company that went bankrupt, and most recently, a tech startup that was hemorrhaging money faster than he could find investors. All 3 of my children had one thing in common. They'd been eyeing my jewelry collection for years. It hadn't always been this way. When they were younger, they'd loved hearing the stories behind each piece. Patricia would carefully try on my mother's pearl necklace while I told her about how Grandma had worn it to church every Sunday for 40 years. Robert would examine my father's gold pocket watch, marveling at the intricate engravings and the way it still kept perfect time after all these decades. Michael would sit fascinated as I showed him the sapphire brooch, explaining how his father had saved for months to buy it for our anniversary, working overtime at the factory to afford something so beautiful. Those had been precious moments, filled with family history and love. I'd always assumed that when my time came, these pieces would pass naturally to my children and grandchildren, carrying our family stories with them. I'd even written detailed notes about each piece's significance, tucked away in my jewelry box for when that day eventually arrived. But somewhere along the way, my children had stopped seeing the history and the love in these pieces. All they saw now were dollar signs. The change had been gradual at first. Little comments here and there about how I should be more careful with my valuable things, or suggestions that I might want to put some pieces in a safety deposit box for security. Then came the more direct approaches. Patricia had started asking about my estate plans and whether I'd considered liquidating some assets to ensure I had enough money for any future care I might need. "Mom, you can't take it with you," she'd said during one particularly uncomfortable conversation last Christmas. "Wouldn't it make more sense to see your family benefit from these things while you're still alive to enjoy it?" At the time, I dismissed it as concern for my welfare. Now I knew better. The truth was I didn't need the money. Harold had been a careful saver, and between his life insurance, our investments, and my own pension from the hospital, I was more than comfortable. My children knew this. They also knew that my jewelry collection, accumulated over 7 decades of marriage and widowhood, was worth well into 6 figures. What they hadn't expected was for me to fight back. Living in the small guest room of Patricia's house for the past 2 years had been presented as a temporary arrangement. "Just until we can figure out the best long-term situation for you, Mom," she'd said after I'd had that minor fall in my own home. "It'll be safer this way, and we can keep an eye on you." I'd agreed reluctantly, selling my beloved home of 50 years and moving into a space barely larger than a walk-in closet. Patricia had been adamant that I bring only the essentials, which somehow included my entire jewelry collection. For safekeeping, she'd insisted. We wouldn't want anything to happen to it. Now I understood why she'd been so insistent. Having my jewelry in her house made it much easier for her and her brothers to inventory it, appraise it, and apparently plan its sale. The conversation I'd overheard had been the final piece of a puzzle I'd been unconsciously assembling for months. The way Patricia would find excuses to go through my jewelry box to help me organize it. The sudden interest Robert had shown in family heirlooms during his visits. The questions Michael had been asking about which pieces were the most valuable, under the guise of helping me update my insurance coverage. They thought I was becoming senile, that my age had made me weak and compliant. They thought I wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. They thought wrong. The past 3 days had been the most challenging of my life, but also the most clarifying. After hearing that devastating conversation, I'd spent hours in my small room, thinking about how to respond. My first instinct had been to confront them directly, to demand they abandon whatever scheme they were planning. But then I realized that would only force them to be more careful, more secretive. They'd find another way to get what they wanted. Instead, I decided to let them proceed with their plan, while I made some plans of my own. The first thing I'd done was contact my old friend Dorothy, who still had connections in the legal community from her late husband's law practice. Through her, I'd found attorney James Morrison, a sharp young man who specialized in elder law and estate protection. That first meeting had been eye-opening. "Mrs. Hartwell," he'd said after I'd explained the situation, "what your children are planning constitutes theft, regardless of their relationship to you. The fact that you're living in your daughter's home doesn't give any of them the right to dispose of your personal property." Mr. Morrison had helped me understand my options, and had prepared several documents that I now carried in my purse. He'd also helped me with the logistics of what I was planning for today. The second call I'd made was to Harrison's auction house, the establishment Patricia had chosen for the sale. I'd spoken directly with William Harrison, the owner and head auctioneer, explaining my situation. His reaction had been immediate and supportive. "Ma'am, we see this more often than you might think," he'd told me with genuine sympathy. "Adult children who assume their elderly parents won't or can't advocate for themselves. I want you to know that Harrison's has a strict policy about verifying ownership, but sometimes things slip through when family members are involved. I'm grateful you brought this to my attention." Mr. Harrison and I had spent considerable time on the phone over the past 3 days, coordinating the details of what would happen today. He'd been more than accommodating, understanding exactly what I hoped to accomplish. The third and most difficult call had been to my oldest friend, Margaret, who'd been my neighbor for 40 years before I'd moved in with Patricia. Margaret was 88 herself, but her mind was as sharp as ever, and she'd been horrified by what I told her. "Evelyn, those children of yours ought to be ashamed," she'd said, her voice shaking with indignation. "After everything you did for them, working yourself to the bone to give them good lives, and this is how they repay you?" Margaret had insisted on helping with today's plan, despite my protests that she shouldn't have to get involved. "Nonsense," she'd said firmly. "Friends stand by friends, especially when family won't." Now, sitting in this auction house, surrounded by strangers examining my most precious possessions, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. These weren't just pieces of jewelry to me. Each one carried memories, stories, connections to people I'd loved and lost. The pearl necklace had been my grandmother's, worn to her own wedding in 1923, and passed down through 3 generations of women in our family. My mother had worn it to my high school graduation, tears streaming down her face as I accepted my diploma, the first person in our family to finish school. The diamond engagement ring had been on my mother's finger for 43 years of marriage to my father, through good times and bad, through the Depression and World War II, through the joy of raising children and the heartbreak of losing 2 babies in infancy. The sapphire brooch had been Harold's gift to me on our 25th anniversary, purchased after months of saving and planning. He'd presented it to me during a quiet dinner at home, his eyes bright with love and pride. 25 years, Evie, he'd said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. 25 years of you making every day better than the last. These pieces weren't just valuable because of their monetary worth. They were valuable because they represented love, commitment, sacrifice, and family history. They told the story of women who'd faced hardships with grace and men who'd worked hard to provide for their families. And my children wanted to sell them to pay for golf club memberships and failing businesses. I checked my watch, a delicate gold piece that had been my sweet 16 gift from my parents, and saw that it was nearly time for the auction to begin. Patricia, Robert, and Michael would be arriving soon, expecting to sit in the back and watch quietly as their mother's treasures were sold to the highest bidders. They'd probably plan to comfort me afterward, pretending they were just as surprised as I was to discover that my jewelry had somehow ended up at auction. What they didn't expect was to find me already here, sitting in the front row, wearing every piece of jewelry that was supposed to be up for sale. The pearl necklace graced my throat, just as it had graced my grandmother's and mother's before me. The diamond ring sparkled on my right hand, catching the auction house lights and throwing tiny rainbows across the catalog in my lap. The sapphire brooch was pinned to my navy blue dress, positioned exactly where Harold had placed it so many years ago. I was wearing my armor, and I was ready for battle. The auction house began to fill as the 1 o'clock start time approached. I recognized several faces from the preview. Serious collectors who'd been examining my pieces with professional interest, obviously planning to bid. A few had even approached me during the preview, complimenting the jewelry I was wearing and asking if I was also here to buy. Something like that, I'd replied with a smile that probably seemed mysterious to them but felt perfectly appropriate to me. At 12:45 I saw them arrive. Patricia walked in first, her practiced eye immediately scanning the room to locate the item she was expecting to see sold. She was dressed in her best Sunday outfit, probably thinking this was some kind of celebration. Robert followed close behind, looking uncomfortable but determined, his wife Carol beside him wearing the kind of false sympathy expression she'd perfected over the years. Michael brought up the rear, and I was shocked by how nervous he looked. His hands were shaking slightly, and he kept glancing around as if he expected to be caught doing something wrong. At least one of my children still had some semblance of a conscience. They found seats about halfway back, positioning themselves where they thought they could observe without being noticed. I watched them in the reflection of a glass display case, fighting back the urge to turn around and confront them immediately. Not yet. I needed to wait for the perfect moment. The auctioneer's assistant began organizing the items for sale on the display table at the front of the room. I watched as she carefully arranged pieces that should have been around my neck, on my fingers pinned to my dress. The irony wasn't lost on me. My own jewelry was being prepared for sale, while I sat wearing identical pieces that my children had no idea I possessed. This was the part of my plan that I was most proud of, the element that had taken the most preparation and would provide the most satisfaction. Over the years, whenever I'd had a particularly valuable piece of jewelry appraised for insurance purposes, I'd quietly had copies made by a master craftsman in the city. Not cheap imitations, but high-quality reproductions that captured every detail of the originals. It had been Harold's idea, actually. "Evie," he'd said after we'd had the sapphire brooch appraised, "what if something happened to these pieces? What if there was a fire or a break-in? Wouldn't you want to have something to remember them by?" At the time, I thought it was a bit extravagant to spend money on copies of jewelry I already owned. But Harold had been persuasive. "Think of it as insurance," he'd argued. "Insurance for your memories." So I'd had copies made of the most significant pieces, the pearl necklace, the diamond ring, the sapphire brooch, and several others. I'd kept the originals in my jewelry box and stored the copies in a safety deposit box, thinking that someday, if something happened to the real pieces, I'd at least have replicas to remind me of them. I'd never imagined I'd need them for a situation like this. 3 days ago, after overhearing that terrible conversation, I'd driven to the bank for the first time in months and retrieved the copies from my safety deposit box. They were perfect. So perfect that even I had trouble telling them apart from the originals. The craftsman who'd made them had been a true artist. Then, in the middle of the night while Patricia's family slept, I'd carefully switched the copies for the originals in my jewelry box. The pieces my children had taken to the auction house were the reproductions. The real jewelry, my grandmother's pearls, my mother's diamonds, Harold's sapphire brooch, was safely around my neck and on my fingers. Patricia had been so confident in her plan, so certain that her elderly mother wouldn't notice or wouldn't be able to stop what was happening. She'd handled the transportation of my jewelry box to the auction house personally, probably feeling quite pleased with how smoothly everything was going. What she didn't know was that she delivered a box full of beautiful copies while the real treasure sat on her mother's dressing table, waiting for this exact moment. At 12:58, William Harrison, the auctioneer, stepped up to his podium. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and a commanding presence that immediately drew everyone's attention. He'd been in the auction business for over 30 years, and his reputation was impeccable. Mr. Harrison's eyes found mine in the crowd, and he gave me an almost imperceptible nod. We'd rehearsed this moment during our phone conversations, and he knew exactly what to do. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began in his rich, authoritative voice, "welcome to Harrison's weekly estate auction. We have some exceptional pieces today, including a collection of vintage and antique jewelry that I'm sure will generate considerable interest." I could feel Patricia's excitement from across the room. This was it. The moment she'd been planning for. In her mind, she was about to watch her mother's jewelry collection be converted into cold, hard cash that would solve all her financial problems. "Before we begin," Mr. Harrison continued, "I want to remind everyone of our policy regarding item authentication and ownership verification. Harrison's auction house has built its reputation on absolute integrity, and we take claims of ownership very seriously." A small murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't the usual opening patter that most people expected from an auctioneer. Several people, including my children, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mr. Harrison picked up the first item, a delicate gold bracelet that had been my great-aunt's. "We'll begin today with lot number 1, a Victorian gold bracelet with intricate filigree work, estimated value $800 to $1,200. I stood up. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head in the room turned toward me. The assistant who'd been preparing to display the bracelet froze with it halfway to the display easel. But the most satisfying reaction came from the middle of the room, where I heard Patricia's sharp intake of breath, followed by Robert's muttered, "What the hell?" and Michael's barely audible, "Oh God." I was wearing the exact bracelet that Mr. Harrison was holding. "Excuse me," I said in a clear, strong voice that carried easily through the suddenly silent auction house. "I believe there's been a mistake." Mr. Harrison looked at me with perfectly feigned surprise. "Ma'am? Is there a problem?" I walked slowly toward the front of the room, my heels clicking on the polished floor with each measured step. Every eye in the place was on me, and I could feel the weight of my children's stares like physical pressure against my back. "Yes, there's a problem," I said, stopping directly in front of the auctioneer's podium. "That bracelet you're holding belongs to me. In fact, it appears that several items in today's auction belong to me." I turned to face the crowd, making sure my voice was loud enough for everyone, especially my children, to hear clearly. "My name is Evelyn Hartwell, and I'm 93 years old. 3 days ago, I overheard my children planning to sell my jewelry collection without my knowledge or consent. They thought I was too old, too weak, or too senile to stop them." The silence in the room was complete now. Even the sound of traffic from outside seemed muffled. Patricia's face had gone chalk white, and I could see Robert frantically whispering something to his wife. Michael looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "They were wrong," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I may be 93, but I am not powerless, and I am certainly not stupid. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, playing his role perfectly. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you claiming ownership of the jewelry collection consigned by Patricia Morrison?" I am indeed, I replied firmly. Patricia Morrison is my daughter, and she had no authority to consign my personal property for sale. None of my children did. I reached into my purse and pulled out the documents that Attorney Morrison had prepared for me. I have here documentation proving my ownership of every piece in this collection, along with a cease and desist order regarding their sale. The room erupted. Several people began talking at once, some expressing outrage at what they were hearing, others asking questions about what would happen to the auction. But above it all, I heard Patricia's voice shrill with panic and anger. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, standing up so quickly that she knocked over her chair. "My mother is not competent to make these decisions. She's been showing signs of dementia for months." The accusation hit me like a physical blow, but I'd been expecting it. It was the nuclear option that adult children often used when their elderly parents refused to cooperate with their plans, questioned their mental capacity. I turned to look directly at my daughter, this woman I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who was now publicly declaring me incompetent in a room full of strangers. "Patricia," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "I am not incompetent. I am not suffering from dementia. What I am suffering from is the heartbreak of discovering that my own children think so little of me that they would steal from me." "We're not stealing," Robert protested, jumping to his feet beside his sister. "We're looking out for your best interests. You don't need all this jewelry sitting around doing nothing." "My best interests?" I repeated, feeling my anger rise. "My best interests would be served by children who respected my wishes and my property. My best interests would be served by a family that valued me for more than what they can get from me." Michael finally stood up and I could see tears in his eyes. Of all my children, he'd always been the most sensitive, the most likely to be swayed by emotion rather than greed. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "we didn't mean for it to happen like this. We were going to tell you." "When?" I demanded. "After you'd already spent the money? After my mother's engagement ring was on some stranger's finger, and my grandmother's pearls were locked away in someone else's jewelry box." I looked around the room at the assembled crowd. Some faces showed sympathy, others showed disgust at what they were witnessing. A few people had their phones out, probably recording what was happening. Good. Let the world see what some adult children were capable of. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "I want you all to understand something. The jewelry that was supposed to be sold here today represents more than just monetary value. These pieces carry the history of my family. They represent love, sacrifice, commitment, and memory." I touched the pearl necklace at my throat. This necklace belonged to my grandmother, who wore it to her wedding in 1923. She was 18 years old, marrying a man she barely knew because her family needed the alliance. But she made that marriage work through 47 years of good times and bad. I held up my right hand, where my mother's diamond ring caught the light. This ring was on my mother's finger when she held me as a newborn baby. It was there when she worked 2 jobs to support us after my father was injured in an industrial accident. It was there when she walked me down the aisle at my own wedding. I touched the sapphire brooch on my dress. And this brooch was a gift from my late husband Harold, purchased with money he saved by working overtime at the factory for 6 months. He gave it to me on our 25th anniversary, and he was so proud that he could afford something beautiful for the woman he loved. My voice cracked slightly, but I pushed on. My children wanted to sell these pieces to pay for golf club memberships and failed business ventures. They wanted to turn family history into cash for their own convenience. Patricia's face was red now, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. "You don't understand the financial pressures we're under, Mom. You sit in that room all day, completely disconnected from reality. Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain a household these days?" "I understand more than you think," I replied calmly. "I understand that you invited me to live with you not out of love or concern for my welfare, but because you wanted access to my possessions. I understand that you've been inventorying my jewelry for months, planning this sale behind my back." I turned back to Mr. Harrison, who had been watching this family drama unfold with professional composure. "Mr. Harrison, I believe we discussed what would happen in this situation." "Yes, ma'am, we did," he replied, nodding gravely. "Ladies and gentlemen, in light of Mrs. Hartwell's ownership claim and the documentation she's provided, This auction cannot proceed as scheduled. All items from the disputed collection will be removed from today's sale." The crowd began to murmur again, some people expressing disappointment at the cancellation, others clearly fascinated by the family drama they'd witnessed. But I wasn't finished yet. "However," I said loudly enough to capture everyone's attention again, "I would like to make an announcement." I reached into my purse again and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Yesterday, I met with attorney James Morrison to revise my will and estate plans. I wanted to ensure that my jewelry collection would go to people who would truly appreciate its historical and sentimental value." Patricia's eyes widened in alarm. "Mom, you can't." "I can and I have," I interrupted. "My jewelry collection, along with the stories and memories it represents, will be donated to the local historical society upon my death. They've assured me that the pieces will be properly cared for and displayed, and that the family histories I've documented will be preserved for future generations." The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. I could see Patricia calculating in her head, realizing that the inheritance she'd been counting on had just evaporated. Robert looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite process what he'd just heard. Michael was crying openly now. "Furthermore," I continued, "I've made arrangements to move out of my daughter's home immediately. I've purchased a lovely apartment in the Sunrise Manor Senior Community, where I'll be surrounded by people who value independence and dignity." This was perhaps the most satisfying part of my plan. For 2 years I'd felt like a prisoner in Patricia's house, confined to a tiny room, dependent on her charity, subject to her increasingly controlling behavior. The apartment I'd found was bright and spacious, with a full kitchen and a beautiful view of the garden courtyard. "You can't live alone, Mom," Patricia protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "What if something happens? What if you fall? Then I'll deal with it like the adult I am," I replied firmly. "I've been taking care of myself for 93 years, Patricia. I think I can manage a few more." I turned to address the crowd one final time. "I want everyone here to witness something. I am Evelyn Hartwell, I am 93 years old, and I am completely competent to make my own decisions about my life and my property. Despite what my children may claim, I am not senile, I am not incompetent, and I am not helpless." I straightened my shoulders and lifted my chin. "I am a woman who worked as a nurse supervisor for 40 years, who raised 3 children as a widow, who survived the Great Depression and World War II, and the loss of the love of my life. I am not going to be bullied or manipulated by anyone, regardless of their relationship to me." The applause started slowly with just 1 or 2 people clapping, but it built quickly, spreading through the room until nearly everyone was applauding. Some people were even standing, giving me an ovation that I hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. Through the applause I heard Patricia's voice shrill and desperate. "This isn't over, Mother. You're making a huge mistake." I turned to look at her one last time. "No, Patricia. The mistake was trusting that my children would treat me with the respect and dignity I deserve. That mistake ends today." Mr. Harrison waited for the applause to die down before speaking again. "Ladies and gentlemen, while we cannot proceed with the scheduled jewelry auction, we do have several other estate collections available for bidding today. We'll take a 15-minute break to reorganize, and then we'll continue with lot number 43, the Victorian furniture collection." People began moving around, some heading for the exits, others gathering in small groups to discuss what they just witnessed. Several approached me directly, offering words of support and encouragement. "Good for you, dear," said an elderly woman with kind eyes. "I went through something similar with my own family. It's heartbreaking, but sometimes you have to stand up for yourself." A middle-aged man shook my hand firmly. "Ma'am, what you just did took incredible courage. I hope if I'm ever in a similar situation, I'll have half your strength." But the conversation that meant the most to me came from an unexpected source. Michael had worked his way through the crowd and was standing beside me, his face streaked with tears. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm so sorry. I'm so ashamed of what we were doing. I knew it was wrong, but Patricia and Robert, they made it sound like we were helping you somehow." I looked at my youngest child, this man who'd always been easily influenced by his older siblings, and felt my anger soften slightly. "Michael, you're 58 years old. You can't blame your decisions on your brother and sister anymore." "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. I know, and I'm not trying to make excuses. What we did was terrible, and I understand if you never forgive us. I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus the kind of performance he might put on to get back into my good graces. What I saw was real pain, real shame, and what looked like genuine regret. Michael, I said carefully, forgiveness is something that has to be earned. It's not something I can just hand out because we share DNA. He nodded, wiping his eyes with his sleeve like the little boy he'd once been. I understand. But Mom, if there's ever a chance, if there's ever a way I can prove to you that I'm not the man who was willing to steal from his own mother, I want to try. Before I could respond, Patricia appeared at my elbow, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. Are you satisfied now, Mother? You've made us look like criminals in front of all these people. I turned to face my eldest child. This woman who had twisted my love and trust into something she could exploit. Patricia, you made yourselves look like criminals by behaving like criminals. All I did was refuse to be your victim. We were trying to help you, she insisted. But even she seemed to realize how hollow that sounded after everything that had happened. Help me what, exactly? I asked. Help me lose my independence? Help me lose my connection to my family's history? Help me feel helpless and betrayed by the people I love most. Patricia's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Behind her, I could see Robert and his wife Carol hovering uncertainly, obviously wanting to leave but not sure how to extract themselves from the situation. Patricia, I said more gently because despite everything she was still my daughter. I spent 65 years loving you, caring for you, supporting you in every way I knew how. I worked extra shifts to pay for your college education. I babysat your children whenever you needed me. I helped you and Frank with the down payment on your first house. Tears were starting to form in Patricia's eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were from remorse or frustration. All of that meant something to me, I continued. It was part of being your mother, part of loving you. But that doesn't give you the right to treat me like your property. It doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my life without consulting me. But you're getting older, Mom, Patricia said, her voice breaking. We were worried about you. We were trying to protect you. Protect me from what? From making my own choices? From maintaining my dignity and independence? I shook my head sadly. Patricia, if you'd come to me and expressed concerns about my ability to care for myself, we could have had a conversation. If you'd wanted to discuss my estate planning or my long-term care needs, we could have involved professionals and made decisions together. I gestured toward the auction house around us. But instead you chose to go behind my back, to steal from me, to treat me like I was already dead. That wasn't protection, Patricia. That was exploitation. Patricia was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. Everything just got so complicated and the money problems kept getting worse, and I thought you thought if you could just take what you wanted without asking, it would solve all your problems, I finished for her. Patricia, I would have helped you if you'd asked. If you'd come to me honestly and explained your financial difficulties, we could have worked something out. This seemed to surprise her. You would have. Of course I would have, I replied. You're my daughter. I've been helping you your whole life. But I would have helped you as your mother. As someone who loves you. Not as someone you could steal from. The difference seemed to dawn on her slowly. Asking for help would have required humility, honesty, vulnerability. It would have required treating me as a person whose opinion mattered, whose feelings were important. Stealing was easier because it allowed her to take what she wanted while maintaining the illusion that she was still in control. Can we fix this? She asked in a small voice. Is there any way to make this right? I looked at my daughter, this woman who had caused me such pain, and felt the weight of 93 years of love and disappointment and hope and heartbreak. I don't know, Patricia, I said honestly. The trust between us has been broken in a very fundamental way. That doesn't mean it can't be repaired, but it would take time and effort and genuine change. What would that look like? Michael asked quietly. He'd been listening to the conversation between his sister and me, and I could see him trying to understand what it might take to earn his way back into my good graces. I thought about it for a moment. It would mean treating me like a person, not like a burden or an asset to be managed. It would mean including me in decisions that affect my life instead of making them behind my back. It would mean valuing my feelings and opinions, even when they're inconvenient for you. I paused, looking at both of them. Most importantly, it would mean proving over time that you see me as your mother who deserves love and respect, not as an obstacle to your financial security. Robert and Carol had finally worked up the courage to approach us. Robert looked deeply uncomfortable, but he seemed to realize that some kind of response was expected from him. "Mom," he said stiffly, "I want you to know that this whole thing was Patricia's idea. I just went along with it to keep peace in the family." I stared at my middle child in disbelief. Even now, caught red-handed, he was trying to shift the blame to his sister. "Robert," I said with cold disappointment, "you're 62 years old. Patricia can't make you steal from your mother. That was your choice, just like it was your choice to participate in appraising my jewelry and planning its sale." He had the grace to look ashamed at least. "I know, You just what? You just thought it would be easy money? You just thought I wouldn't find out? You just thought I was too old to fight back." Robert's face reddened. "It wasn't like that, Mom. We were concerned about your future care costs." "Stop lying," I interrupted, my patience finally exhausted. "Just stop. We both know this had nothing to do with my future care costs and everything to do with your current financial problems." The truth hung in the air between us, ugly and undeniable. Robert's mouth tightened, but he didn't try to deny it again. "Here's what's going to happen," I announced, looking at all three of my children. "I'm going to leave with Mr. Harrison now to finalize the return of my property. Tomorrow, I'm moving into my new apartment, and I don't want any of you involved in that process." Patricia started to protest, but I held up my hand. After that, I continued, "If any of you want to try to rebuild our relationship, you'll need to prove to me that you understand what you did wrong, and that you're genuinely committed to doing better. That's going to take time, and it's going to require actual change, not just apologies." I looked directly at each of them in turn. "I love you all, but love isn't enough anymore. You've broken my trust in the most fundamental way possible. If you want to be part of my life going forward, you're going to have to earn it." With that, I turned and walked toward Mr. Harrison, who had been discreetly waiting near his podium during the family confrontation. The crowd parted to let me through, and I heard several more words of encouragement and support. "Mrs. Hartwell," Mr. Harrison said as I approached, "I have the paperwork ready for you to sign. Your jewelry will be returned to you immediately, of course." "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. You've been incredibly kind throughout this whole ordeal." He smiled warmly. "Ma'am, in 40 years of running auctions, I've seen a lot of family disputes over estate items, but I've never seen someone handle a situation with as much grace and strength as you've shown today." As we walked toward his office to complete the paperwork, I caught sight of myself in a mirrored door. There I was, 93 years old, wearing my grandmother's pearls and my mother's diamonds and my husband's sapphire brooch, looking more like myself than I had in years. For 2 years living in Patricia's house, I'd felt diminished somehow. Smaller. Less important. Like I was taking up space that belonged to someone else, using resources that weren't really mine, existing on borrowed time and borrowed charity. But standing there in that auction house, having just publicly defended my right to make decisions about my own life and property, I felt like Evelyn Hartwell again. Not Patricia's elderly mother or Harold's widow or someone who needed to be managed and protected, but myself, a complete person with rights and dignity, and the strength to stand up for both. The paperwork took about 20 minutes to complete. Mr. Harrison had his assistant carefully pack my jewelry in protective cases, treating each piece with the respect and care it deserved. As she wrapped my grandmother's pearl necklace in soft velvet, I thought about how different this moment was from what Patricia had planned. In her version of today's events, strangers would be handling these precious pieces, examining them for flaws, calculating their monetary value, and ultimately taking them home to people who knew nothing about their history or significance. Instead, my treasures were being returned to me, still carrying all their memories and stories, still connecting me to the generations of strong women who had worn them before me. "Mrs. Hartwell," Mr. Harrison said as we finished the last of the forms, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but what you did today was remarkable. I've seen too many elderly people victimized by family members who think age equals weakness." "Thank you," I replied, "though I have to admit, I couldn't have done it without your help and cooperation." It was my pleasure, ma'am. And I want you to know that if you ever need anything, if your family causes you any more problems, you have my card. Harrison's has resources and connections throughout the community. I tucked his business card carefully into my purse, touched by his continued concern for my welfare. I appreciate that more than you know. As we prepared to leave his office, Mr. Harrison asked, "Do you need a ride home? I'd be happy to arrange transportation." I smiled, feeling a rush of independence and possibility. Actually, I have my own car, and I'm perfectly capable of driving myself. But thank you for asking. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. For months, Patricia had been questioning my ability to drive safely, suggesting that perhaps I should consider giving up my license for everyone's safety. She'd started insisting on driving me to doctor's appointments and grocery shopping, gradually taking control of my mobility and independence. But I'd never stopped being a good driver. My reflexes were still sharp, my vision was fine with glasses, and I'd never had an accident or violation. Patricia's concerns had been about control, not safety. Walking out of Harrison's auction house, carrying my reclaimed jewelry and heading toward my own car, I felt a freedom I hadn't experienced in years. The drive to my new apartment gave me time to think about what had just happened and what would come next. I'd stood up for myself in the most public way possible, and while it had been necessary, it had also been painful. Watching my children's faces during that confrontation, seeing the shock and embarrassment and anger, had broken my heart even as I'd found my strength. But I'd learned something important about myself today. I'd learned that love without respect isn't really love at all. It's possession. My children had told themselves they loved me while treating me like property to be managed. They'd convinced themselves they were acting in my best interests while completely ignoring my wishes and feelings. Real love would have included me in their concerns about my future. Real love would have respected my autonomy and dignity. Real love would never have involved secretly planning to sell my most treasured possessions. Sunrise Manor was everything the brochures had promised and more. The apartment I'd chosen was on the 3rd floor, with large windows overlooking beautifully maintained gardens. It had a full kitchen where I could cook my own meals when I wanted to, a spacious living room where I could entertain visitors, and a bedroom large enough for all my furniture. Most importantly, it was mine. No one could tell me when to go to bed or what to eat or whether I was allowed to have visitors. No one could go through my belongings or make decisions about my property without consulting me. The moving truck had arrived that morning, bringing the furniture and possessions I'd kept in storage since selling my house 2 years ago. Walking into my new home, surrounded by things that belonged to me and reflected my tastes and my history, I felt like I was reclaiming not just my independence but my identity. I spent the afternoon unpacking my jewelry collection, carefully arranging each piece in the beautiful wooden jewelry box that had been my mother's. As I handled each item, I thought about the stories I would tell to the historical society, the memories that would be preserved along with the physical objects. My grandmother's pearl necklace went in the special compartment where it had always lived. As I closed the lid, I could almost see her wearing it to church all those Sunday mornings, her back straight and her faith unshakable. My mother's diamond ring found its place in the ring holder Harold had made for me in his workshop 40 years ago. The diamonds caught the afternoon light streaming through my new windows, throwing tiny rainbows across the bedroom wall, just like they had in our house all those decades ago. The sapphire brooch was pinned to the velvet lining of the jewelry box, positioned where I could see it every time I opened the lid. Harold's gift, Harold's love, Harold's pride in being able to give me something beautiful. All of it still there, still meaningful, still mine. At 5 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Margaret standing in the hallway with a bottle of champagne and the biggest smile I'd seen from her in years. "Evelyn Hartwell," she said, walking into my new living room. "You are my hero." Dorothy called me as soon as she heard what happened at the auction house, and I've been grinning like a fool ever since. I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. I still can't quite believe I did it. "Well, I can," Margaret said firmly, setting the champagne on my kitchen counter. "I've known you for 40 years, Evie, and you've always been the strongest woman I know. You raised 3 children alone after Harold died, worked full-time while running a household, and never asked for help from anyone." She looked around the apartment approvingly. "It's about time you got back to being yourself instead of letting those children of yours treat you like an invalid." We spent the evening toasting my newfound independence and freedom. Margaret caught me up on all the neighborhood gossip I'd missed during my 2 years at Patricia's house, and I told her about my plans for my new life at Sunrise Manor. There's a book club, I explained excitedly, and a garden club, and they have bridge tournaments every Friday night. I haven't played bridge in years, but I used to be quite good at it. What about your children? Margaret asked gently. Do you think any of them will come around? I considered the question carefully. Michael might, I said finally. He seemed genuinely remorseful today, and he's always been the most sensitive of the three. But Patricia and Robert? I shook my head. I think they're too invested in seeing me as the problem to admit they were wrong. Well, Margaret said, raising her champagne glass, their loss. You're going to be too busy living your best life to waste time on people who don't appreciate you. That night, alone in my new bedroom, I lay in bed thinking about the day's events. In the space of a few hours, I'd gone from being a victim of my children's greed to being the author of my own story again. It hadn't been easy. Confronting Patricia, Robert, and Michael in such a public setting had required every ounce of courage I possessed. But it had also been necessary. They'd been counting on my silence, my compliance, my unwillingness to make a scene. By refusing to be quiet and cooperative, by demanding the respect and dignity I deserved, I'd reclaimed not just my jewelry but my sense of self. The next few weeks settled into a comfortable routine. I unpacked the rest of my belongings, arranged my furniture to suit my tastes, and began exploring all the activities and amenities Sunrise Manor had to offer. The book club turned out to be exactly what I'd been missing. Intelligent conversation with peers who valued my opinions and insights. The garden club allowed me to get my hands dirty again, working with soil and plants in the community greenhouse. And the bridge tournaments were a revelation. I discovered that not only had I retained my skills, but I'd actually improved with age. Years of life experience had given me better judgment about when to take risks and when to play it safe. Most surprisingly, I'd made new friends. Real friends, people who liked me for who I was rather than what I could do for them, or what they could get from me. 3 weeks after the auction house confrontation, Michael called. Mom. His voice was hesitant, uncertain. I was wondering if I could come see you. If you're willing to talk to me. I'd been expecting this call, though I wasn't sure I was ready for it. What do you want to talk about, Michael? I want to apologize, he said simply. Really apologize, not just say I'm sorry because I got caught. I want to try to understand how I became the kind of person who would steal from his own mother. Something in his tone convinced me to give him a chance. All right, but we meet here in my apartment on my terms. Of course, he agreed quickly. Whatever you're comfortable with. He arrived the next afternoon carrying a small bouquet of daisies, my favorite flowers, something he'd remembered from childhood. He looked nervous and older than his 58 years, like the events of the past few weeks had aged him. Mom, he began as soon as I'd offered him coffee and we'd sat down in my living room, I need you to know that I understand what we did was theft. Not estate planning or financial management or looking out for your best interests. Theft. I was surprised by his directness. Go on. I also need you to know that I understand why you can't trust me anymore. He continued. Trust isn't something you can just apologize back into existence. It has to be earned, and I have no idea how long that might take or even if it's possible. He looked around my new apartment, taking in the furniture and belongings that clearly belonged to me, that reflected my tastes and personality. This place suits you, he said with a sad smile. You look more like yourself than you have in years. I feel more like myself, I admitted. Living with Patricia, I felt like I was disappearing a little bit every day. Michael's face crumpled slightly. Mom, we did that to you. We made you feel like you weren't important, like your wishes didn't matter. I can't believe I was part of that. For the next 2 hours we talked more honestly than we had in years. Michael told me about the financial pressures that had made him vulnerable to Patricia's scheme. His business debts, his fear of bankruptcy, his shame at being nearly 60 years old and still struggling financially. But none of that excuses what I did, he emphasized. Plenty of people have money problems without stealing from their parents. I told him about the loneliness and powerlessness I'd felt living in Patricia's house, about the gradual erosion of my independence and self-respect, About the shock of discovering that my own children saw me as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I keep thinking about when I was little, Michael said, tears starting to form in his eyes. And you used to show us your jewelry and tell us the stories about each piece. You made it all seem so magical, so important. It was important, I said softly. It still is. I know, he whispered. And I was willing to sell those stories, those connections to our family history, just to solve my own problems. What kind of man does that make me? It was a question I couldn't answer for him. He was going to have to figure that out for himself. Before he left, Michael asked if there was anything he could do to begin making amends. There is one thing, I said, surprising myself. I'm planning to donate my jewelry collection to the Historical Society when I die, along with written documentation about each piece's history and significance. But I realized that some of the stories I remember might not be complete or entirely accurate. I looked at him seriously. I'd like you to help me research our family history, to make sure the information I leave with the collection is as thorough and accurate as possible. It would mean spending time together, working on something that honors our family's past instead of exploiting it. Michael's face lit up with something I hadn't seen there in years. Genuine enthusiasm for a project that didn't involve making money. I would love that, he said. I'd be honored to help preserve those stories. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. Patricia called a few days later, her voice stiff and formal. Mother, I think we need to discuss your living situation. This apartment is all well and good for now, but what about when your health declines? What about when you need more care? I almost laughed at her persistence. Even after everything that had happened, she was still trying to manage my life, still assuming that I was incapable of making my own decisions about my future. Patricia, I said calmly, I've already made arrangements for my future care needs. Sunrise Manor has multiple levels of service, from independent living all the way through skilled nursing care. If and when I need more assistance, I can transition to a higher level of care without leaving the community I've chosen. But what about the cost? How are you planning to pay for all of that? With my own money, Patricia. The same money I've been using to take care of myself for 93 years. There was a long pause. I still think you're making a mistake, shutting your family out like this. I haven't shut anyone out, I corrected her. I've simply established that being part of my life requires treating me with respect and dignity. That shouldn't be too much to ask from my own children. We always treated you with respect. Patricia, you tried to steal from me. You planned to sell my most treasured possessions without my knowledge or consent. You told people I was incompetent when I refused to cooperate with your schemes. None of that is respectful. Another long pause. I was trying to protect you. No, I said firmly. You were trying to control me. There's a difference. The conversation ended shortly after that, with Patricia hanging up in frustration. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. I'd hoped that the shock of being caught might prompt some genuine self-reflection, but it appeared that Patricia was more invested in being right than in repairing our relationship. Robert never called at all. As summer turned to fall, my new life at Sunrise Manor continued to exceed my expectations. I joined the resident council, helping to plan activities and advocate for improvements to the facility. I'd started volunteering at the local hospital, reading to patients and providing companionship to people who didn't have family nearby. Most rewarding of all, Michael and I had begun our family history project in earnest. We'd spent hours at the library, researching genealogy records and historical documents. We'd tracked down distant relatives and old family friends, gathering stories and photographs that I'd never seen before. The process had revealed layers of family history I'd never known existed. My grandmother hadn't just been a woman who wore pearls to church. She'd been a suffragette who'd marched for women's voting rights and had run a small business from her home during the Depression to help support her family. My mother hadn't just been a devoted wife and mother. She'd been a talented seamstress who designed and made clothes for the wealthy women in town, using the income to supplement my father's wages and ensure her children had opportunities she'd never had. These discoveries made my decision to donate the jewelry collection even more meaningful. The pieces weren't just valuable objects. They were artifacts of strong, determined women who'd faced adversity with grace and creativity. Working with Michael on the research had also begun to heal the rift between us. Not completely, The trust was still fragile, and I remained cautious about becoming too dependent on his involvement in my life. But slowly, carefully, we were building a new relationship based on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than obligation and manipulation. One afternoon in October, as we were organizing our research materials in my apartment, Michael looked up from a stack of old photographs and said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." My heart skipped a beat. Had he been in contact with Patricia and Robert? Were they planning some new scheme? "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Patricia's been calling me," he said, confirming my fears. "She wants me to try to convince you to move back in with her, or at least to give her power of attorney so she can help manage your finances." I felt a familiar surge of anger and disappointment. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that your finances don't need managing, that you're perfectly capable of making your own decisions, and that if she wanted to repair her relationship with you, she needed to start by respecting your autonomy." I stared at my youngest child, hardly believing what I just heard. "You stood up to Patricia?" Michael laughed ruefully. "I know it's hard to believe. Patricia's been telling me what to think and do for so long that I'd forgotten I could have my own opinions. But working with you on this project, seeing how capable and independent you are, has reminded me that she was wrong about a lot of things." "How did she react when you refused to help her?" "She was furious," he admitted. "She accused me of being manipulated by you, said you were playing victim to turn your children against each other." I shook my head sadly. Even now, months after the auction house incident, Patricia couldn't accept that I was acting out of strength rather than weakness. "Michael," I said carefully, "I need you to understand something. I'm proud of you for standing up to your sister, but I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between us. If you want to maintain a relationship with Patricia and Robert—" "I don't," he interrupted firmly. "Or at least not the kind of relationship we used to have. I can't go back to being the little brother who goes along with whatever scheme they come up with. I've learned too much about myself and about you to pretend that dynamic was healthy for any of us." That evening, I called Attorney Morrison to update him on my situation and to make sure all my legal documents were current and properly filed. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said warmly, "I have to tell you, word of what happened at the auction house has gotten around the legal community. You've become something of a legend among elder law attorneys." I laughed. "I'm not sure being a legend was part of my retirement plans." "Well, you've certainly inspired some important conversations about elder rights and family dynamics. I've had several clients mention your story as an example of why they want to be proactive about protecting themselves." "I'm glad something good has come out of all this," I said. "Though I have to admit, I never imagined I'd be having these kinds of problems with my own children." "Unfortunately, it's more common than most people realize," Attorney Morrison replied. "Adult children often have trouble accepting that their aging parents are still autonomous individuals with the right to make their own decisions. We reviewed my will, my healthcare directives, and the various legal safeguards I'd put in place to protect myself from future manipulation or exploitation. Everything was in order, but I felt better having confirmed that my wishes would be respected regardless of what my children might try to do." As winter approached, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that shocking conversation I'd overheard in Patricia's kitchen. In the space of 6 months, I'd gone from feeling powerless and invisible to feeling more in control of my life than I had in years. The jewelry collection that Patricia had tried to steal was now safely in my possession, with detailed documentation of each piece's history and significance prepared for its eventual donation to the Historical Society. The stories and memories that my children had been willing to sell were now preserved for future generations. More importantly, I'd rediscovered my own strength and independence. At 93, I was living alone, driving my own car, managing my own finances, and making my own decisions about how to spend my time and energy. It wasn't the retirement I'd envisioned when Harold and I had made our plans all those years ago. We'd imagined growing old surrounded by children and grandchildren who visited regularly, who valued our wisdom and experience, who would help us navigate the challenges of aging with love and respect. Instead, I found myself having to choose between my dignity and my family relationships. It had been the hardest decision of my life, but I knew it had been the right one. On a cold December afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. My granddaughter Sarah, Patricia's eldest daughter, stood at my door with tears streaming down her face. "Grandma Evie," she said, using the nickname she'd called me since childhood, "I need to talk to you. I need to apologize for my family." Sarah was 35 years old, a successful attorney with a family of her own. She'd always been my favorite grandchild, though I tried never to show favoritism. She was intelligent, independent, and had inherited the strong moral compass that seemed to have skipped her parents' generation. "Come in, sweetheart," I said, wrapping her in a hug. "You don't need to apologize for anyone else's actions." "But I do," she insisted as we sat down in my living room. "I should have spoken up when I heard what Mom and Uncle Robert and Uncle Michael were planning. I should have warned you or tried to stop them somehow." "You knew what they were planning?" Sarah nodded miserably. "Mom told me about it a few weeks before the auction. She presented it as this reasonable solution to their financial problems and your future care needs. But something about it felt wrong to me." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was a coward," she admitted. "I was afraid of causing family drama, afraid of making Mom angry with me. I told myself it wasn't really my business, that you were adults who could work things out yourselves." She wiped her eyes with a tissue from my coffee table. "But after what happened at the auction house, after hearing how Mom and the uncles had been treating you, I realized that staying neutral wasn't neutral at all. It was taking their side by default." I reached over and took her hand. "Sarah, you're not responsible for your mother's choices. You were put in an impossible position." "But I'm a lawyer, Grandma. I know elder abuse when I see it, and I should have recognized that's what was happening. Instead, I let my personal relationships cloud my professional judgment." We talked for over an hour, and I learned that the family drama had created divisions that went far beyond my relationship with Patricia, Robert, and Michael. Sarah's younger brother had sided with his mother, arguing that I was being unreasonable and ungrateful. Sarah's husband had supported her decision to distance herself from the family conflict, but it had created tension between Sarah and her parents that might never be repaired. "Grandma," Sarah said as she prepared to leave, "I want you to know that what you did took incredible courage. You stood up for yourself when no one else would, and you showed all of us that being elderly doesn't mean being powerless." "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you know. And I want you to know that you're not alone in this family. You have grandchildren and great-grandchildren who love and respect you, even if their parents have lost their way." Sarah's visit reminded me that families are complicated, multi-generational entities where the actions of one generation ripple through all the others. My confrontation with Patricia, Robert, and Michael hadn't just affected my relationships with my children. It had forced their children to choose sides and take stands that might define their family relationships for years to come. As 2023 drew to a close, I found myself looking back on what had been simultaneously one of the most difficult and most empowering years of my life. I'd faced betrayal by the people I loved most, but I'd also discovered reserves of strength and independence I hadn't known I still possessed. The jewelry collection that had been the catalyst for this entire ordeal remained safely in my possession, but its meaning had evolved. The pieces were no longer just beautiful objects with sentimental value. They'd become symbols of my refusal to be victimized, my insistence on being treated with dignity and respect. On New Year's Eve, Margaret and several of my new friends from Sunrise Manor gathered in my apartment for a quiet celebration. As we toasted the coming year, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: genuine optimism about the future. "To Evelyn," Margaret said, raising her champagne glass, "who taught us all that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. To second chances," added Helen from the book club. "To new friendships," contributed Dorothy from the garden club. "To independence," I said, raising my own glass. "And to the strength we find when we refuse to let other people define our worth." As I looked around my living room at these women who'd become my chosen family, I realized that while I'd lost my biological children's respect and love, I'd gained something equally valuable: a community of peers who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide for them. The road ahead might still hold challenges. At 93, I was realistic about the limitations that age might eventually impose. But whatever the future held, I would face it as Evelyn Hartwell, a woman who'd learned that dignity and self-respect were not negotiable, regardless of age or family pressure. My grandmother's pearls still graced my throat on special occasions, My mother's diamond ring still sparkled on my finger. Harold's sapphire brooch still held a place of honor in my jewelry box. But now they carried an additional layer of meaning. They were symbols of a woman who'd refused to let anyone, even her own children, treat her as less than the full person she'd always been. In the end, that might be the most valuable inheritance I could leave behind. Not the jewelry itself, but the story of how I'd fought to keep it, and in doing so had kept myself whole. The auctioneer had indeed been stunned that day, but not by the value of the jewelry or the drama of the family confrontation. He'd been stunned by the sight of a 93-year-old woman who refused to be anyone's victim, who chose dignity over peace, independence over security, and self-respect over family approval. And in that moment, standing in front of that room full of strangers, wearing my family's treasures and claiming my right to make my own decisions about my own life, I'd been stunned too, stunned by my own strength, by the power that comes from finally saying enough, by the liberation that follows the decision to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. They'd said I didn't need my jewelry anymore. They'd been wrong about that, just as they'd been wrong about so many other things. I needed those pieces not for their monetary value, but for what they represented. A legacy of strong women who'd faced adversity with grace, who'd made sacrifices for love, who'd built lives of meaning and dignity despite the limitations their times had placed on them. I was the latest in that line of strong women, and I'd proven that strength doesn't diminish with age. It just becomes more concentrated, more essential, more impossible to ignore. The auctioneer's surprise that day had been nothing compared to my children's shock at discovering their mother was still very much in control of her own story. And that story, I decided, would have the ending I chose for it. Not the ending others tried to write for me.